guess. Yes. Oh, no. There we go. Yeah, hi everybody. So, my name is Peter Powell. I'm the CEO of the Welsh Dee Trust. The Welsh Dee Trust, we are an independent environmental organisation that works. Our objective is a River Dee in North Wales and Cheshire, which is free of pollution and full of wildlife. I like to think ourselves, we're an organisation that focuses really heavily on getting out there on the ground and identifying and making the sort of tangible improvements to the river that will help us reach that objective. We're not really a campaigning organisation. We want to be out there, spade in hand, making those fixes and fixing the river. Today I'm going to focus on really one specific pollutant. The Dee suffers from many of the pollutants. Tom gave us a good introduction of all those variety of things. I'm going to focus on one really specific one today, which is phosphorus, which is probably the one that's getting quite a lot of headline news at the moment. There we go. So phosphorus is a nutrient. The chemical is phosphorus. It's found in rivers as phosphate. Really, it is for the Dee and for a lot of rivers in Wales and probably the UK, it is the limiting factor for algal growth. So if you get more phosphorus, you get more algal growth, and you don't get as much algal growth because there is not enough phosphorus in the river. Because of human activities, we're adding more phosphorus to the river, we're getting more algal growth, and in its worst case scenario, that means we're getting algal blooms like this. This is Llyn-Tegid, which isn't too far from here this summer. Algal bloom, so much phosphorus, nice warm weather, and just the algae just gets away from itself. That algae then sucks all of the oxygen out of the water and really starts to disrupt the ecology of the river. That's phosphorus at its sort of most worst, but even at much lower levels, you're getting more algal growth. You get algal growth on the base, and it really does disrupt the ecology of the river through that process of essentially fertilizing the plant growth, which is then sucking the oxygen out of the water. So really there's a whole raft of different sources of phosphorus pollution. We have, Tom touched on, so agriculture, manures, human manures, so through sewage, it's in toothpaste, it's in cleaning products, it's added to drinking water to try and stop lead pipes leaching into the drinking water, so we actually add it into water. So the sources are quite numerous, but really there's two main pathways for how it's getting into our rivers, and that's from agriculture and that's from sewage, and they're probably what I'm going to focus on today. So yeah, it's become a really hot topic at the moment, phosphorus. That's because most special area conservation rivers and freshwater bodies will all have, and marine water-based ones will all, whether SACs, will all have a target for the amount of phosphorus that should be found in part of the natural system. For the Dee, this is the SAC area, and you can see how it's all, which areas have passed that target and which areas have failed. In 2016, there was some research done, and there was a court case in Holland that essentially meant those targets became much stricter than they had been previously. That's led to a lot of water bodies and SACs then failing for phosphate, and it's also made it very difficult for planning departments to put into action. It's meant to require that all plans then have to put in place mitigation to offset any new phosphorus that could be added to the watercourse. The biggest challenge with that is around building new houses, building new infrastructure. If you build more houses, you're adding more toilets to a catchment. If you're adding more toilets to the catchment, you're adding more sewage, and ultimately you're adding more phosphorus, even if it's treated. So the big challenge, the big two questions for phosphorus and phosphate at the moment are, where is it coming from, and trying to identify those sources, and then how we actually fix that problem. And that's what I've sort of focused on. So where it comes from is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. We have broad ideas. We know it comes from sewage. We know it comes from agriculture. But when you actually start looking at something like the River Dee, trying to hone down the specific areas within that catchment where you need to focus, that becomes more challenging. On the Dee, there's two main pieces of work that are looking at this. So Dŵr Cymru and NRW have done some SAGES modelling. What they've essentially done is look at what's coming out of the sewage treatment works, do some monitoring of the watercourse, see how much phosphorus there is, and then do some estimation and predict where most of the phosphate is from, and also where that source is. Roughly in the Dee, it's 45% from sewage and 45% from livestock. Every river is slightly different, and even different tributaries of the River Dee are different, but it's, you can say it's roughly 50% sewage, 50% livestock, with some other smaller sources like road drains in there as well. That's a model. It's got quite a few issues, as all modelling does. It's not quite accurate. So one of the things we are doing at Welsh Dee Trust is using citizen scientists to just absolutely swarm the catchment with water quality monitoring. So we've got citizen scientists who are trained to go out and take a water quality sample using a phosphate strip, and from that we can start to identify a bit more precisely what we're trying to find is the specific pipe that phosphorus or that polluted water is coming out of, so that then we can start trying to tackle those problems. Those are our results on the right. Again, citizen science is, it's absolutely amazing tool. We've got, I think, sort of 40, 45 active citizen scientists across the Dee now, monitoring really regularly. It does have some slight biases. There's problems of access, and so some places you won't get to. I think there is a slight bias towards warm and dry weather, because like everyone, citizen scientists much prefer to go out when it's sunny, not when it's raining. So and probably most of the phosphorus pollution is coming when it's raining, so you sort of, you might have some biases that way. But we're finding it a really, really useful tool for actually identifying where those problems are. So yeah, I'm just going to focus now on what we're finding as an organisation. We're going out there trying to find the sources of thing. As I said, most of it's coming from agriculture and sewage. We have a water-wise farming programme. So this is a program of work that we deliver that works specifically with agriculture and farms to identify and tackle the sources of pollution. This is what I've been doing as part of the Rivers Trust now for 12 years. So I've spent a lot of time on a lot of farms. I think I've probably visited about 300 farms to talk about agricultural pollution. And there's some really there's essentially 3 common ways that we're finding on farms for how that pollution is how that phosphorus and manure is getting into the watercourse. The first one is direct from livestock. This is a pretty simple one, really. If you have livestock and they stand in the river, they'll do their business in the river, and that is about as direct a pathway as you could ever get, probably. Probably not a major source. I don't think it's the major source of agricultural pollution, but where it does have an impact is obviously those very hot summer days when rivers are at their absolute lowest and we haven't had rain for a very long time. That is also when livestock goes and finds the nice cool stream to go and stand in, and they'll stand in it all day. So even though it's maybe not the largest source, when it is having an impact, it's probably when the rivers and watercourses are the most vulnerable to additional pollution. A pretty simple solution, really, and we do loads and loads of this at Welsh Dee Trust, is fence out watercourses so that you don't have that livestock access, so that they're not able to stand in the river all day, and provide alternative drinking sources somewhere else in the field where they can get their drinking water. This also has great habitat benefits, and most of the reason we do it is for habitat restoration, but it does have this pollution benefit as well. This is the second source, and is from the farmyard, and in my experience, I think this is actually probably the largest source of phosphate and agricultural nutrient pollution into our rivers. This is one of the rivers. This is a farm that we've worked with. Essentially, it all comes down to sort of old, broken infrastructure within the farmyards. Obviously, a farmyard is a concentrated area of livestock, normally with concrete, hard standing. You're bringing, in the winter particularly, you're bringing all of your, particularly cattle or poultry, you're bringing them all into really quite a focused area, quite high concentrations of livestock and manure. essentially the problem, and it's normally always the problem, is that there's a clean water drain. So that's a drain in the farmyard somewhere that goes straight to a ditch or to a watercourse, and the manure or the slurry or the poultry manure is finding its way into that clean water drain and then into a watercourse. This is an example. So that on your right-hand side is this is on a dairy farm on the Dee. That area behind the green door is the loafing area, so that's where the cattle are standing before they go into milk every day. So they're stood there, 300 cattle, I think it was, are stood behind that gate every day for a couple of hours. Obviously, that many cattle standing around for a couple of hours, you get a lot of manure. Most of the slurry was going away from the gate in the opposite direction into the slurry lagoon. It was getting collected in the slurry lagoon and then getting spread onto the fields, which is, and being used as fertilizers to grow the grass, to feed the cows. The cycle for phosphorus that we want to have in place. But some of it was making its way under the door into this, which is a clean water drain, and you can see the pipe on the other side. That's where it's kind of spilling out into the field, and that was going straight into a pond and straight into the River Dee. Probably not a huge source, but we're finding this really commonly across lots of farms. So, even though one farm, it might be a small source on one farm, added up, I think this is probably one of the most significant sources of agricultural pollution, particularly in the Dee, particularly in those livestock agricultural, particularly dairy farms, where the cattle are coming in every day. So this is a good news story. So this is one, we worked with this farm and fixed it, and we created and designed this project where we essentially put in a concrete, raised the level of floor, sorted out the guttering so that there was less clean water going in there, so the slurry was easier to manage, and made sure it all tipped back the other way, fixed it, very easily solvable. And the farm contributed money towards this, and we helped support with project management and a little bit of funding as well. Most of these sort of pollution incidents are covered by regulation, so they are covered by the SAFO regulation, and they are covered, mostly through the SAFO, which is the slurry, stylage and agricultural fuel oil regulations, which is around how you store these things on a farmyard. Makes it very hard to fix because ultimately you can't grant fund it because the farm is breaking a regulation. Also means it's not a suitable mitigation for if you're trying to develop or build houses and you're a council looking to mitigate offsetting a new housing development and the phosphorus of a new housing development. You can't go and pay for a load of farms just to become legally compliant. It's just not suitable. It needs a carrot and a stick approach. Welsh Dee Trust, we're the carrot. We're out there working with farms to try and fix these problems, but it does need significant enforcement, and it needs farms inspections, and it needs people from government bodies out on farms identifying and picking up these problems. I think if we fix that, we can make a massive dent. 50–60% of the agricultural pollution, I think, is coming literally from clean water drains on farmyards. And then the third major source is from overland flows. So slurry, manure, should all be collected on the farmyard and spread out onto the fields, where it's then used as fertilizer to grow the next crop, and you have a sort of continuous cycle of farming cycle where you're producing food and growing crops. The problems come essentially where either the manures are being spread in bad conditions and they're having an impact because they're not getting into the crops and they're not getting into the soil and being used up by the crops to grow. They're actually just getting washed off straight away into a watercourse. So that's spreading before heavy rainstorms, spreading onto very steep fields, and it's all getting washed off. The other problem is where there's just way too much manure slurry being added to the field, so much more than the crop needs to grow. This is probably most evident in the Y at the moment, and all the poultry manure. There's so much more poultry manure on quite shallow soils, growing grass in permanent pasture that doesn't need that much nutrient, doesn't need that much phosphorus and nitrates to grow. And so you get very high indexes within the soil, and then it just starts to leach out into the groundwater and eventually into the rivers. Quite a hard thing to fix, and there almost isn't a fix. Even once you stop applying too much, you have to give it a long time for that phosphate to leach down through the groundwater and appear out in the rivers. Sadly, that means these fields, like the Y, where there's been excess added for quite a long period of time, even if you stop and didn't apply anything today, you're still going to see high elevated levels for many years to come, I'm afraid. And so ultimately what I think the solution is, and I'll put this in here as a bit of an aside, but it's a big part of everything I believe, really. Soil, 70, 80, 90, I can't remember the figure, but 70% of our land is farmland in the UK. I don't know what it is for D, but huge amounts. It's all soil. Soil health, and if you have an unhealthy soil, that soil cannot hold on to the water and then the nutrients as well as a healthy soil. If we improve soil health, it can hold on to nutrients really significantly. And I really think this is the key to not just flooding, but also mostly to pollution. This is a compacted soil. We find this probably 60, 70% of the fields we look at within the D catchment are compacted to some level. You can see it's compacted. There's very little air pores, and you can it looks shiny, and you can imagine water just not soaking into it. Whereas this would be a healthy soil, where you can imagine the water it looks more like a sponge, essentially, and it actually stores and holds onto that water. And because it stores and holds onto the water, you get less overland flows, and it also holds onto the nutrients better. And it means that the crops can get access to those nutrients easier, so you have to apply less in the first place. So really, this is just me saying I think soil health is really, really important to river and water health. And my plea to take soil health seriously. And so then the other major source is sewage. This is the other major source of phosphate. Septic tanks, as Tom touched on, I won't touch on very much, but I think they make up about 9% of the phosphorus into the River Dee, which is a significant source on their own. It's essentially very old septic tanks that have not been looked after and are not modern are the issue. We find significant problems with them where they're all in remote areas, because the septic tanks are used in remote areas, and in some cases they can be the only pollution source on a river, because there's very, very low level of farming, there's no sewage treatment works, but you do have a faulty septic tank that can be quite a significant source. So even though they're only 9% of the total phosphorus pollution across the D, in localized areas, they can be quite a significant problem. Treated effluent. So essentially the sewage treatment system. Phosphate is treated. When raw sewage is treated, under a normal system, the phosphate isn't removed, and so you get quite high levels of phosphate into the treated effluent. There's a tertiary process that can be put in where you essentially add ferric phosphate to the raw sewage, and the ferric phosphate causes the phosphate to solidify, and it gets caught up in the sludge, and then the sludge becomes higher in phosphate, and that gets included and put and spread out onto fields. Quite an effective system. You can only do it up to a certain level, because you get to a place where you're adding so much ferric sulfate to the effluent that actually the iron starts to become a polluting impact on its own. So you can only do it up to a certain level. So it only works part of the way. And also, you're not actually removing that phosphate from the system, because you are collecting it, solidifying it, and then you're spreading it out onto fields. Well, if those fields have already got very high levels of phosphate, then you're going to get leaching that way. This is Five Fords, so treatment works where they do have ferric phosphate treatment. Phosphate stripping is not a way to do mitigation, but what you can do is put a wetland and run the treated effluent through a wetland system. This is one in Norfolk. This is becoming the main way that mitigation is being looked at. Essentially, the plants grow in the wetland, they use all the phosphate, they die, and because the wetland is permanently wet, they get locked up in the soils in the bottom of the wetland. So you can design that wetland so that you never have to empty it for like 150 years, and slowly you are locking that phosphorus away. And that's why it works as a mitigation, because you're actually taking the phosphorus out of the system. And so this is why this has become probably the most common source for mitigation systems, and I think it's probably the only reasonable way we've got of taking phosphorus out of the system en masse. And then the other one, which is the one that's getting a lot of the news at the moment, I will flip back, is the overflows. Sewage overflows is basically, essentially, raw sewage. The sewage treatment work can't cope, and raw sewage is spilling out into the river, full of phosphorus, but also all the other nasties. The solution really is one, upgrading our sewage treatment works, which is going to cost a huge amount of money, but I think every penny spent is well worth it, but I would say that. And then the other one, I think we really need to look at how we change drainage and what we're putting down drains across our urban areas. And we are just starting to look more and more at sustainable urban drainage. Within Wrexham, within Chester, within areas where we know sewage treatment works are overwhelmed. We need to hold water in our urban areas for longer before we discharge it to sewage treatment works. I'm not sure. I think this will have a huge impact on phosphorus. It has a huge impact on certainly like microplastics and a lot of the other pollutants that we're getting. Yeah, big plus for sustainable urban drainage. But as a mitigation for actually trying to remove phosphorus from the system, it's probably not suitable, and it's quite a challenge, because even though you reduce the water and the phosphorus, it's still going into the sewage treatment works, and it's either going to come out of the treated sewage or it's going to be stripped. So there is some ways that it may provide mitigation for housing building, but it's not as clear path. Yeah, so that's it. That's a very, very sort of quick overview of phosphorus pollution in the River Dee and where it's coming from. Thank you very much.